I just want to introduce to you our speaker today, Pastor Boyd Hopkins. Boyd, thanks for being here with us today.
Absolutely. You can hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you. It's awesome.
Good. Well, for those of you who know, I've been on a journey of rebuilding an old house. I am packed in here. You can't see any of my boxes right now, but I'm sitting here facing a window, catching some light in the midst of my mess. So it's good to be here. So I have a message that I'd like to share with you. And actually, you know what? This message, I didn't originally sit down to write this as a message per se, but I ran into a situation here a little while ago, and it got me thinking. And honestly, I've run into a number of situations recently that have had me thinking along this line. Let me just start with a word of prayer, and I'll share with you some of my line of thought. God Almighty, I tell you I love you, and I thank you for the opportunity to get together with you and with each other. Father, I thank you for each person that sees this presentation, that entered into worship in the words of those songs, that, Lord, as we now look into your word, I ask you that you would teach us what true worship is. And I pray, let it be done in Jesus' name. Amen. I came out of a liturgical church background. I've been in a number of different church backgrounds. I've been in, I've ministered across denominational lines over the years. I sometimes jokingly call myself a Lutheran Menabapticostal, and I had to practice saying that because it took some learning. But my Lutheran background, that's where I came from. And it was there that God found me a number of years ago and totally changed my life. And he used a couple of Pentecostals to do it. And then he kept me in my church background, and he led me on a journey there. And as I've walked through that journey, one of the things that I think, over the years I've seen a lot of is I've seen a lot of judging, a lot of condemnation. People who condemn themselves, who live under condemnation because they failed to perform, because they feel God's angry at them. Yes, there's all that kind of stuff too, but there's also a lot of judging within the church, where we judge one another based on appearances, and where in that judging, I think we find, we lose something. I think one of the things that the devil loves is when we judge each other. When we look at one another and we make judgments about each other's worth, about the quality of each other's worship, about whether we are good enough for each other, whether we're right, whether we're wrong. When we do that kind of judging, make those kinds of judgments without spending time with one another to get to know one another, I find it's harder to judge my family members that way. Why is that? They tick me off sometimes. I come home and I find the dish is not done, and my brand new kitchen in a mess and all that kind of stuff, and I get ticked off. And yet, I remain in relationship with my family members. We work things out, things get cleaned up, whatever else. But we remain in relationship with each other. Why? Because we've been with each other long enough to know each other, to know that we love each other. And I think that is so deeply important. When Jesus talked about how they will know you as Christians by the love you have one for another. They will know us as his followers by the love we have one for another. In 1 Corinthians 13, that love is defined as something that is long-suffering. It puts up with a lot of stuff. It doesn't take offense. It's not that you don't get frustrated, but we don't take offense, and we don't drop out of fellowship with each other, out of relationship with each other, even though we may frustrate each other because we love each other. So anyway, this thing, it's been going through my head a little bit, and I guess it's been going through my head because I ran into a situation here a little while ago. A man walked into a church, and he obviously had some of his baggage of his own. And he looked around and he saw a cross on the wall. And then he saw a small statue of Jesus. And he immediately said to the people there, quite loudly, "Idolatry, you're idolaters, worshiping these things." And he left. And what did he do when he did that? Well, he judged the thoughts of people's hearts. He did not stop and talk to them. He did not ask why those things were there. What was the purpose of this cross? What was the purpose of this small statue of Jesus? He made a snap judgment. He classified everybody in the place as an idolater, and he walked out. I ran into somebody here a little while ago who was told me that if we had a Christmas tree, we were idolaters. You know, the Christmas tree originally was a pagan thing. The early Christian church took over Christmas, the Christmas season, and some of those items, and what we call redeemed them, changed the meaning behind them, and began to use them to, I don't know, as parts of a holiday where we worship Jesus. But I've run into a lot of people who think, you know, if you have a Christmas tree, you're worshiping pagan gods. If you worship on Sunday, as somebody told me a while ago, you're worshiping the sun god. If you worship on Christmas, you're worshiping pagan gods. Because it's Christmas, because that used to be a pagan worship day. Interesting. So what do these people do? They make snap judgments. They look at others, and they say the thing that conditions your worship as to be Christian or not is whether it's on a day, whether there's a statue in the room, whether there's a tree with some lights on it. These are the things that condition worship. And based on those things, they make judgments, and we lose something. We lose the opportunity to get to know each other, to share in the purpose of Christ. Anyway, you know, we lose fellowship. Somehow this man, I think back to the man who walked in and saw the little statue of Jesus on the cross and he made that judgment. Immediately that whole church was, what do we do wrong? What should we do? Should we get rid of the cross? Should we get rid of the statue of Jesus? What do we do? And suddenly in that place, the focus on Jesus was lost as people struggled with, how do I please someone? How do I not offend someone? Maybe I did offend someone. What does the worship look like? Maybe we should take this out of here. The focus on Jesus was lost. And I think, you know what? That day the devil laughed. The devil laughed because the focus on our Savior was lost over such things. Anyway, so I thought, you know, I'm going to go look at some passages. It's interesting because one of the passages that I went to immediately was comes out of Exodus 20. It's actually the Ten Commandments. And this is where one of these people that I spoke to about this kind of thing took me. It says, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other God before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third, fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to the thousands of generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." Anyway, it says, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in earth above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not make for yourself an image. And this is where this man's mind went to, who walked into the church, and he saw an image of Jesus. A clay image, painted image, but an image of Jesus. And he said, you are idolaters. And he refers back to this. He says, you will not, because you have that image, you are idolaters. You know what? We need to read the rest of the passage, because that is not all that it says. You know, it says, you shall not bow down to them or worship them. This idea of not making an image is conditioned by the statement or the directive of God right after it. You will not worship it. So I looked up this word image. I looked up this Hebrew word. Sometimes it's translated as you will not make for yourself a graven image. And the definition of a graven image is you will not make an image of anything in heaven or on earth, of human form or of non-human form, with the intent of worshiping it. Once your intent is to worship this thing you have made, it has become for you an idol. But it becomes an idol because in your heart you choose to worship it. Does that mean we cannot make any form of an image? I went looking through, we've been moving. I went looking for this. This is a piece of art. But if I go with the mentality of the man who walked into the church and said, "You're all idolaters," this is an idol. Just because it is an image of a created thing. It is an image of a fish that God has made, that some artist has put into metal. And because that artist had made this image, it has now become an idol. Is that true? Not according to Exodus, not according to the Ten Commandments. Because this image of these fish was not made with the idea of worshiping anything. It was made as an art form. You know, it's funny actually, because I remember studying in college, and I took this course called Interdisciplinary Studies. And in interdisciplinary studies, what we did was we studied ancient cathedrals. And we began to look at these old cathedrals. And I remember as we studied the old cathedrals, and you could walk into an old Catholic cathedral today, or an old Orthodox cathedral today. In some places, you can even walk into Protestant churches, even New Line Protestant churches today, and find some of these things. What was done in a lot of these old churches was they turned the whole place into this long journey of art. You walk in the back door, and you walked into the place of separation, and then you started the journey to the altar. And as you look at the cathedral around you, you begin to see this progression. And what they are doing in some of these old cathedrals is because the people couldn't read back in the day. They did everything in art. They built the statues. They painted the frescoes and the images on the walls. And ultimately, they took you to the altar. And as you looked above the altar, you saw heaven opened above you, and you saw the salvation story. Now, somebody who walked into that place and made the judgment that all of those things were idols would wipe all that away with a judgment that we were all idolaters, and they would walk out and they would miss that story. The story done in those old temples, they did make images, but they were not images to worship. They made images to teach. And there is a difference between an image that is an illustrated image and an image that was made as a graven image, an image to worship, where people worship the image instead of the God who created that thing. So we have to make a differentiation here. We have to understand the difference between these images. We very often use images. It's funny because the church that this man walked into, and he saw the little statue of Jesus, the pastor a week before that had been using that statue to teach the little children about Jesus, and he was using a visual image with that little statue. But this man walked in and he made a judgment, and he walked out and he lost the opportunity to engage a group of amazing people. So this whole image, what is an idol? Well, an idol is something that we make that is other than God, that we choose to worship instead of God. And if we don't choose to worship it, it is not an idol. Then it's a piece of art, then it's an illustrative thing, it's something else, but it is not an idol. So just to make an image doesn't mean that we're breaking the commandment. Actually, when I was thinking about this, I got thinking about the story of Naaman, and I want to take you to 2 Kings chapter 5, because the story of Naaman is an amazing story. It's a story of offense, it's a story of pride, it's a story of judgment, it's a story of magic, interestingly enough. It's a story of a great change of heart. It's a story of a revelation, and it's a story of grace. and how God empowered one man to live in grace, even though there was sin all around him. I want to read you this story. Now Naaman was commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. Aram was a country. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captives and a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. And this girl said to her mistress, Naaman's wife, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." So Samaria at the time, right, was in the kingdom of Israel. And this young girl says, "You know what? If this new master of mine, who is one of the oppressors, an officer of an army that oppresses Israel, if he would only go to Israel, where I come from, and see this prophet, he would be cured." So, Naaman goes to his master. He hears about this, and he's thinking, "Oh, somebody out there can cure me." Okay, so here we are. He goes to his master, and he says to the master what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. That's a bucket load of money right there. Naaman, the letter he took to the king of Israel read this: "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes, and he said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? What does this fellow send someone to me to be cured for his leprosy for? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." So here's the king of Aram. He hears about this prophet that lives in Israel, and he goes, "Oh, they got a prophet that lives in Israel who can cure leprosy. Fine, I'll send a reference letter. Here's my servant Naaman. You cure him of leprosy. We're good to go." And the king of Israel is the one, "What are you trying to do?" The king of Israel apparently doesn't know about the prophet that lives in his own land. And if he does, he has no faith in the guy. And he's going, "This guy is sending me people to cure of an impossible disease. I can't do it. He's just trying to pick a fight with me." Anyway, Elisha's the prophet in the story. The man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, and he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there's a prophet in Israel." In other words, Elisha says, "You don't believe that there's a prophet? You don't? Japers, man. Send the guy to me." He says, "God will prove that there is a man of God among you." Right? So Naaman goes with his horses and chariots, and he stops at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger out to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Pretty simple instructions. But Naaman went away angry, and he said, "I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. In here we see a little bit of Naaman's mind. See, Elisha's so rude. He doesn't even go to the door. He sends his assistant to the door. I mean, Naaman in his country is a bigwig. He is a high general. He commands a lot of troops. He expected to be treated with some deference and some respect. And he gets angry. He gets an assistant that was sent to the door that says, "Go wash in that muddy river called the Jordan River." And we begin to see the mentality that Naaman has when it comes to stuff like healing. He sees it as magic. And he has expectations in his head. He has a picture of what he thinks should happen. This guy should come out. He should perform big ceremonies. He should call on his gods. He should wave his hand over the spot, and he should cure me. That's his stereotype. That's his expectation. "I thought," he said. And when what he thought didn't happen, he let his anger and his disappointment dictate his actions, and he almost missed what God wanted to do because of it. So, this says something to me. When I have somebody that comes into my church, or when I know somebody that comes into a church and they have false expectations, and they're running on those false expectations, and their anger kicks in, I have to be careful that I don't respond to them in a like way. When we let our anger and our stereotypes and our false expectations run the show, we can miss what God has for us. Anyway, Naaman's servants went to him and said, my father. The images, they sort of come up to this guy, they bow down, they are very respectful. But I think these servants, we have stories in the Bible about servants who love their masters. I think these servants must have loved their master, because instead of letting the guy just rage off and do his thing, they risked their own safety, and they come up to him. My father, they said, if the prophet had told you to do some great heroic thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you this simple little thing, wash and be cleansed? Naaman goes, fine. Okay, well, that's sort of my paraphrase. Fine. So he went down and he dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. That is amazing. That is an amazing transformation. You should Google an image of what leprosy looks like. This guy goes down. He goes down to an obscure river, the Jordan River. It's muddy. It's disgusting. And he dips himself in 7 times, and it says his flesh is transformed, and he is healed, and it is made new like a young boy. And the amazement that must have happened for him as he did this. We aren't told that the transformation happened on the last dip. Did it partially happen with each dip? We're not told that. Because what? Probably because we would make a formula out of it. But he was healed. Naaman obeyed. And what did his obedience cost him? Well, he was already angry. It's an amazing man or woman, when you are already angry and disappointed, to stop and do something. Naaman showed some character here. He was angry. His servants who loved him came and said, why not do the little thing? And he could have raged off. He didn't. A reminder of the book of James, I think it's James 1:19. It says, beware of anger, basically. It says, the anger of man does not work the righteousness of God. Anger makes us selfish. And when we let anger drive us, we can often miss what God has for us. So the next time you're angry, be careful. Understand that anger can make you selfish. It can cause you to miss what God has for you. Do the little thing. Well, that's what Naaman did. He obeyed. And what did it cost him except his pride? It cost him his anger. Wow. What did it cost him but his expectation of what it should look like? Again, he had an expectation. It should be a big, dramatic, massive, wild thing, with chanting priests and big ceremonies and waving of hands. And it wasn't. It was dipping in water. Simple. It cost him his expectation of what it should look like. And, if we are not willing to give up our expectation of what it should look like, what the move of God should look like, we can miss that too. And I was talking with a guy here a little while ago, and we were talking about revivals. And he said, you know what, we haven't had a revival for a long time. I said, on the contrary. I said, one of the biggest revivals to me, in my mind, in the last 20 years, has been the Alpha Course. Alpha Course is an outreach course designed in England, designed by some Anglican priest. And it was taken on by a couple of other Anglican priests, and then the final guy that tweaked it was Nicky Gumbel, and he put it out, and God just took it, used it to sweep around the world and win millions of people for Christ. But because it didn't fit the stereotype that so many of us have of revivals, we don't consider it a revival. If we don't give up our expectations sometimes and our stereotypes, we can miss what God has. What did Naaman do? He just did a simple act of obedience, and he did it to see what would happen. The guy didn't have any faith. He was angry that this God didn't show up and do what he wanted him to do. But the servants came and said, just do what you're told and just see what happens. So that's what he did. He jumped into the Jordan, dipped himself 7 times to see what would happen. I remember meeting a young lady one time. She was a rape survivor. She lives in town here, the same city I live in. And her story's in the book that I wrote on forgiveness. And her name is Trina, and she likes me to tell her name, so I do. That young woman, she was a rape survivor, and I remember her struggling with the unresolved brokenness in her heart, the rage and the anger. And I remember asking her, are you willing to forgive your perpetrator? Perpetrator never been brought to justice and never would. And at that point in time, it wasn't even about getting justice anymore. It was just a matter of her being able to survive. Will you put this person in the hands of God and let him go? It's not right. We're not saying it's right. It's not fair. We're not saying it's fair. It's not just, and we're not saying it's just. You're going to put him in the hands of God, and God's going to deal with him. Are you willing? No. Okay. I said, can we invite Jesus into your hatred for this person that abused you and destroyed your life? Can we do that? She looks at me and she goes, basically did what Naaman did. She said, sure, just to see what'll happen. And she prayed a simple prayer with me, and we said, dear Jesus, I hate my perpetrator. I love hating him, and I kill him in my mind every time I can. I hate him. She goes, how can I pray a prayer like that? I said, how can you not? It's honest. She goes, okay. Dear Jesus, and we prayed that prayer. And then she said, I'm not willing to forgive him, but I'm willing to invite you into this anger and this hate that I have for it, just to see what you'll do. We finished the prayer. She came back. She said, something happened. I said, what happened? She said, I don't know, but the rage is going. The hate's going. I don't know what's going on. She said, I said to her, well, you invited Jesus into your hate just to see what he would do. You did what Naaman did. Naaman said, okay, fine. I will get into that river just to see what will happen. There was no faith involved at all, other than a simple obedience. And maybe that's exactly what faith really is. Maybe that faith, when we are asked by God to do something and we say, fine, I don't really feel like I have any faith for this thing, but I'm willing to do it just to see what will happen. And we allow God to move through simple obedience. Obedience is not something we like in modern culture. We are taught that we have rights. We are taught that our right to the most important thing. We are taught that we should have our own way. We're not taught to obey. The only way we're taught to obey is the cops will get you, so there's a threat. But God comes to us and he says, I love you, and I want to do something in your life. And he gives us this stupid thing to do, like Naaman. Go dip yourself. Yeah, well, it's not the big dramatic thing, Lord. Actually, you know what? I had a guy giving me a word of prophecy about a week and a half ago, and he said, God's going to do something in your life. And he says, when he does it, it's not going to feel big and it's not going to feel dramatic. Your work is to just do it regardless of how it feels. But God's going to work through it. That's what he did to Naaman. Anyway, so the obedience had its result. It says Naaman and all his attendants, after the healing, they turned around and they went back to the man of God. And he stood before them and said, I know now that there's a God. Forgive me, let me reread this. When Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God, and as far as I know, that means Gehazi, Elisha's servant, who he sent out to talk to Naaman. But right now, Naaman's pride is all gone. He is amazed. He's been healed. And he stood before him, before this man of God. And he said, now I know there is no God in all the world except in Israel. So please accept the gift from your servant. What do we see in Naaman? We see a shift. We see a shift away from the magic. We see a shift away from this expectation that some local witch doctor has this supernatural power. We see a shift in a man who suddenly sees a God who loves him, has experienced the touch of that God, and says, this God is the only God. You know, back in Naaman's day, there was a God in every hill, there was a God in every valley. We think we've got lots of gods today. Oh my goodness, there are gods everywhere back in this culture. And there are guys that they would just pick up and go into the next county over because the God in the next county was somehow more powerful than the God they had in their county. Now Naaman is suddenly convinced there is no God but this God of Israel. And he says, now please accept the gift from your servant. That is an act of worship toward the God of Israel. He's not worshiping Elijah. He's not worshiping Elisha's servant. He's saying, you represent this God. Please allow me to give you a gift of gratitude. But he acknowledges the God of Israel. So this was the result of Naaman's obedience. This was the result of the healing that came as a result of Naaman's obedience. It totally blew him away. It met his need. And you know what? We can't even, how do you put it? It brought his faith to life. Now he knew that there was a God in Israel, and this God had captured his heart and his worship. And the prophet answered, oh, I guess he is standing in front of Elisha. As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. You understand this about true prophets of God? They don't sell God's power. They don't sell God's word. I have run into places where I've seen prophets selling prophecies. $500 line. You want a $500 prophecy over here? $1,000 line. $1,000 prophecy over here. Where prophets will sell themselves. A true man of God, in this context, Elijah is this man of God, and the amazing things. Read about the guy, the stuff that was done through him, but he refused to sell it. Elijah, his mentor, was the same way, and God took care of them. It's a hard life, but I mean, it makes sure that there are no phonies. There are no phonies. You don't find prophets of God selling themselves, except for the phony ones. So he says, surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing. And though Naaman urged him, please take some, he refused. If you will not, please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings. There's a whole story behind that. And then he asked this special thing. So I want you to think about Naaman. Naaman is a pagan general serving a pagan king who worships basically what Jeremiah calls demons, what the Apostle Paul calls demons, Isaiah. They all talk about how these idolatrous things that are false gods, they're actually demonic entities. This man, up until very recently, was one of these worshipers. Suddenly he's touched by the Spirit of God, he is healed by the Spirit of God, and he becomes a worshiper of the one true God, the God of the Bible, the God that we see represented in Jesus. And then he says this, but may the Lord forgive your servant for one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimmon, which was an idolatrous god back then, to bow down, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord forgive your servant for this. I got to unpack this for a minute, because the language is a little weird. May the Lord forgive your servant. He's talking about himself. So may the Lord forgive me, Naaman, for this one thing. When my master, the king of Aram, enters the temple of Rimmon to bow down to worship that god in that temple, and he is leaning on my arm, and I have to bow down. So this is what Naaman has to do. Part of his job is he has to escort his boss. He has to escort his king into his king's idolatrous temple, and he has to hold this man's elbow to let him kneel while he worships his false god, and then he has to lift this guy to his feet and help him back out. Naaman doesn't just quit his job. He doesn't just say, I refuse to perform that duty anymore. Naaman says, let my Lord forgive me when I have to do this. And in doing so, well, let me read it. The response of Elisha is, go in peace. So I want to say this. I'm just going to read what I wrote here. Faith was now alive in Naaman. He was now in a heart worship relationship to God Almighty. That means he loved God, he worshiped God, he served God. Two things. Immediately he knew that the worship of any other god was sin. And he also knew that his job as the servant of king of Aram, collided with his new faith, because he had to escort his master into the temple of a false god where his master worshiped. What should he have done? Refuse to do it and die? Well, this is what he did. He asked God for grace to continue to serve his human master, a man who had been very good to him. He asked for God to know that when he did his job, his heart was still given to the one true God in worship. In other words, his kneeling in that temple with his master was not an act of worship. In his heart, he was sold out to the God of Jesus. What was Elisha's response to him? Elisha's response was, go in peace. You know what that means in our language? It means it's all good. It means God's got you covered. It means God sees your heart, and his grace covers you, and he knows that what you were doing in the line of your work is not worship to another God. And his mercy covers you even there. Go in peace means God's grace covered Naaman. And because in his heart his dedication was to the Lord, he would not be held responsible for the sin of worshiping another god, even though he knelt by his human master who did worship another god. Why? Because the fact was, Naaman was not worshiping another god. In his heart, he was committed to the one true God, and that commitment protected him, even when he was required to be a part of someone else's worship to a false god. This is the same teaching of Jesus that we see in John 4. True worship comes from the heart, in spirit and truth. It is not a thing of outside action. I can walk into an occult temple and worship my God there like Naaman, because God looks at my heart, and worship comes from the heart. Can we understand this? Listen to the conversation Jesus had with the woman at the well. This is a story how Jesus confronts false worship. He reveals what is true worship. And what is true worship? It's conditioned by where it comes from, the heart, the spirit of a person, and who it is focused on. It's not conditioned by stuff like crosses hanging on a wall, small statues of Jesus sitting on an altar somewhere, whatever you want. Jesus said, he spoke to the woman, and the woman actually responded to him, starting in John 4:19. Sir, the woman said, I can see you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. You know, again, I think about I've met all these people lately that they're getting caught up in this crazy idea, and I call it crazy because biblically it is, that real worship isn't real worship unless it's done on the seventh day, Saturday, the Sabbath. Now, you can worship on Saturday, the Sabbath, but biblically, according to Jesus, that does not make your worship any better than anybody else's worship. Now, this is what this woman said to Jesus. She said, you Jews think that the only true worship can happen in Jerusalem. My people, we think the only true worship can happen up on this mountain. And Jesus' response to the woman is this. He puts an end to that kind of thinking by when he says this to her. Woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. So, true worship, what is it? It's not bound to a place, to a culture. It's not bound to traditions. It's not bound to times or days or hours. It's not bound to festivals. It's not conditioned by stuff like Christmas trees or statues or whatever you want. It is bound by what your heart is focused on. And when your heart is turned to Jesus, God reaches through everything else that is around you, and he sees what is in your heart. And when I think about, the healing thing. When you come to him in simple obedience like Naaman, okay, Lord, this doesn't fit what I've been trained to think. But because you say it, I will do it. That simple obedience from the heart, that is true worship. Worship is an attitude of the heart. It's an attitude of the spirit, and nothing else matters. And the woman said, I know that Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he will explain everything. And Jesus declared, speaking to her, I am he. So you know what, my friends? What I want to say about this. I want to say that God calls to us in our hearts. And he hears what is in our hearts. And, maybe we have angry hearts. He looks under the anger and he sees the pain, and he hears the cry that is behind the anger too, Just because Naaman got angry right away didn't invalidate, God probably tweaked one of his servants and says, talk some sense into this guy. But God looks at the heart. And you can come into a church and you can look weird, and you can wear strange stuff, and you can be an artist, and you could like all the pictures on the walls. But if you're not an artist and you don't like all the pictures, don't judge the artist who likes the pictures. What if you're an artist and you look at the guy who doesn't like the pictures and you think, the guy's got no imagination? Don't judge the guy with no imagination. Let us not judge one another, because when we do, we lose focus on Jesus and the devil laughs. Let us turn to Jesus in the thoughts and intents of our hearts. Let us worship him, and let us use every way to do so. And the God who calls us into faith will touch us, will heal us, will hear us, ultimately will accept us into heaven. Bless you all. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Boyd. Thank you for sharing the truth with us today.